Okay, so welcome to the third in a series of 4 short videos looking at an increasingly important concept, monopsony power in a market. In this video, we're going to be asking the question, what kind of policies and different forms of intervention by the government might be useful to control the exploitation of monopsony power? In the previous video, we argued that monopsony power can bring both benefits and costs in terms of economic welfare. Well, there are lots of potential strategies to sort of counterbalance or overcome monopsony power in markets. Sometimes it involves regulation, and we'll spend a few minutes in a second looking at the impact of the grocery adjudicator, which was created in 2013 to help just monitor what was going on in terms of the relationships between the big supermarkets and the farmers, the growers, the food manufacturers that supply them. So we'll come back to that example in a second. There's a role also for competition policy. In particular, they may well block some mergers, some takeovers, if it's felt that the merger, the acquisition would give a large firm too much power, both in selling goods and services and also buying inputs. So monopsony is now coming into place as a factor they look at when they potentially investigate mergers and takeovers. Encouraging, establishing producer cooperatives can be a very helpful counterbalance to monopsony buyers. Again, we'll think of an example in a second, but a cooperative is where small-scale producers come together. Individually, they have very little bargaining power at all with major buyers, but perhaps a cooperative has a greater clout in the market. Increasingly, we find tougher laws, tougher standards on ethical sourcing of supplies. So businesses, multinationals, for example, that might be tempted to use their global monopsony power to drive down costs, prices and standards in their supply chains can be often highlighted by social media and taken to task by national governments. And another option is to encourage the technology, digital technologies, online platforms, for example, for suppliers to sell direct to consumers. Many farmers now, for example, if they're not getting a great price from a supermarket, well, they can set up their own small businesses, they can diversify and perhaps sell some of their produce direct to consumers and miss out the monopsonistic middle person. The grocery conduct adjudicator was created in 2013, and it adjudicates, in other words, it makes decisions on issues relating to the groceries supply code of practice, which sounds very exciting, but essentially they monitor the trading practices of the 10 regulated grocery retailers, including Tesco, the Co-op, Sainsbury's, that any retailer that has a turnover of more than £1 billion a year. What they're trying to do is they're trying to create fair dealing in the supermarket sector. So, for example, they tried to prevent supermarkets suddenly delisting a product from the shelves of a particular manufacturer. They tried to investigate allegations of unfair practice and things, and generally try to be positive as well. When a retailer has a great relationship with a supplier, that can be highlighted too. Here's a lovely example of government intervention, a lovely example of regulation in action, with the pub code regulator deciding that Heineken, one of the world's biggest beer makers, has abused their monopsony power, their market power, to force this firm's pub division to stock a disproportionately high quantity of their drinks. In essence, this has restricted the ability of a landlord in the Star Pubs and Bar Group to choose which beers and ciders to stock, and ultimately it's limited consumer choice. I mean, Heineken, of course, is contesting this, but Heineken's been fined for forcing pubs to stock too many of its beers. And here's another good example. The prompt payment code has been introduced by the government. This is where the government is trying to, again, strike at the monopsony power of big firms when it comes to late paying of smaller suppliers. It'd be interesting to see whether this was also applied to the supermarkets, who are also renowned as late payers. So big businesses told to speed up payments to small suppliers, particularly, of course, during the pandemic, where many small suppliers have been struggling to survive. A really good example to finish with of overcoming monopsony is where the growers themselves may come together to form a cooperative. Here's an example from the UK. Arla Foods Now, in fact, as a European example, Arla Foods is owned by nearly 10,000 farmers across Europe, about 2,500 actually are British. And Arla Foods is basically a business which produces milk, processes milk, and then sells it, and other related products to supermarkets. They've got quite a few brand names: Castello, Cravendale milk, you may have heard of, and Lurpak butter is also one of their products. Now, if you have a big producer cooperative, that gives them some selling power, which can be a counterbalance to the monopsony power of the supermarkets. One of my favourite examples actually comes from Ethiopia, the Aroma Coffee Union. The Aroma Coffee Farmers Cooperative Union is a smallholder coffee growers owned cooperative established about 20 years ago. Has over 20,000 farmers. There are 400, there's loads of cooperatives now in Ethiopia. And basically the idea is, again, no one coffee grower can have any meaningful impact on the price that they get from those big multinational coffee buyers. So a cooperative will be better placed to negotiate perhaps a better price with transnational corporations. And some of that price could be invested in processing equipment and branding and to get more value added. Fair trade movement is important, it's significant. Some of you will have studied it and many of you will consume fair trade products. I think the impact has been relatively limited so far, but we are seeing the rise of lots of cooperatives globally. Of course, in the long run, suppliers, farmers need to develop resilience so they can effectively compete against the buying power of a monopsonist. So what's happened here is a good example of a partnership between the Aroma coffee growers and Union Direct Trade by branding and selling their own products. And typically, the farmers get a price about 50% above the fair trade minimum. So again, here's the idea of selling direct, creating a processing business, creating a commercial relationship with a direct trade organisation, which essentially bypasses the major coffee buyers and tries to sell direct into supermarkets. Well, we've seen in this video some examples of how potentially you can overcome some of the monopsony power. It's not easy because big firms have buying power and that doesn't go away quickly. Now, in the fourth video in our series, I hope you found this series helpful. We're just going to go through 5 past question multiple choice questions on monopsony power. It's a great chance to see if you've understood the material, and we can have a go at these questions together.